Welcome to the Need to Know podcast from the Wilson Center, a podcast for policymakers available to everyone. Always informative, nonpartisan, and relevant, we go beyond the headlines to understand the trend lines in foreign policy. Welcome back to another episode of Need to Know. I'm your host, John Milewski. Need to Know is a podcast produced by the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. The center is congressionally chartered, scholarship-driven, and fiercely nonpartisan. Need to Know is a podcast for policymakers available to everyone. Well, there was a time not long ago when headlines around the world were tracking the latest news from the Korean Peninsula, largely focused on North Korea's ongoing efforts to increase its long-range missile capabilities. Since then, attention has shifted to Afghanistan, Ukraine, and now Gaza for understandable reasons, but Kim Jong-un and North Korea have not gone away, and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea remains one of the world's least understood countries. Joining us to discuss North Korea is a Wilson Fellow who's working on a project that he hopes will dispel a number of myths about the DPRK. He is Sung-Yoon Lee. Among other things, Yoon is the author of The Sister, the extraordinary story of Kim Yo-jong, the most powerful woman in North Korea, which one reviewer called essential reading to understand the nature of the world's most tyrannical and reclusive regime. Welcome, Yoon. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So, Yoon, before we begin on some of the particulars, I want to ask you a bit about your process. How does somebody go about understanding North Korea from the outside looking in?
With considerable difficulty. Well, North Korea tells us a lot. Their main news agency is read by many North Korea watchers, and most times it's kind of mind-numbing, the language. But if you read between the lines, you can take away some key messages, their intentions, and also some fake messages and information as well. So it's sort of a laborious kind of work, but because of my interest in North Korea and my, my not very flattering view of the North Korean regime and its cruel human rights violations, I'm sort of committed to this laborious and difficult task. North Korea is very crafty. They say crazy sounding things all the time, so we tend to be dismissive of them, but nothing in North Korea is spontaneous, it's all choreographed. In fact, North Korea bans jazz, can you believe? Why? Because jazz is all about individualism, improvisation, being unconventional and different. So North Korea doesn't even allow that kind of creative thinking and individual impulses. So it's the most tyrannical, totalitarian state in history.
That's fascinating that maybe jazz could spill over into other areas and a little improvisation goes a long way.
Yes.
About the constant misunderstanding, I can't help but think of the mantra that will haunt many for the rest of their lives in the aftermath of 9/11, after the invasion of Iraq. We'll be greeted as liberators. Got that one wrong. Is it because we continue to project our own worldview and our own cultural sensibilities onto other parts of the world when we attempt to understand it? Is that why we get it wrong?
I think so. Mirror imaging is a natural human impulse, inclination, I think. So it's not irrational, but at the same time, the United States government has historically underestimated client states like the Kuomintang, the nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek during the Second World War, because he depended on U.S. military and financial support. Maybe he'll listen to us. That kind of thinking. We've seen that kind of mistake with respect to South Korea's first president, Syngman Rhee, who was educated in the United States. He has degrees, PhD from Princeton, MA from Harvard, a BA from George Washington University. He lived in the U.S. for some 40 years, spoke fluent English, of course. So Americans considered that, regarded Syngman Rhee would be compliant, would be content to be a yes man to the United States. My point here is dictators and soft authoritarians, everyone, they have their own agenda. They have their own ambitions and oftentimes tend to go along with what American or former Soviet Union or today Russian, Chinese supporters say, but they have their own, secret goals. So oftentimes they don't listen to you. They don't listen to the United States.
So you've already blown a few myths out of the water, particularly this notion of a crazy nation run by a crazy man, and what you've described as something very deliberate, very intentional. We may not understand all of the goals, but clearly there are goals there, and they are not just playing someone else's game. What are some of the other areas you've looked at and some of the myths or misconceptions that you've uncovered?
Well, if I were to ask an audience the following question, for example, why does a nation of 25 million people, North Korea, why does it maintain a standing army of 1.2 million men, which in absolute terms puts North Korea among the biggest military in the world today? Why do they allocate such resources, vast resources into the military? Because military power is really the only lever that they have in terms of economic power or soft culture, soft power. North Korea doesn't have much to flaunt to the outside world. So exporting insecurity, issuing threats credibly, that's North Korea's game. Conventional normal democracies try to increase their standing in the world through innovation, research, development, trade, and so on. That's not what North Korea does. North Korea, like an elite athlete who enhances their value by performance on the court or field, North Korea enhances its net value by exporting insecurity, by expanding its nuclear arsenal, by becoming an imminent security threat to the democracies in the region, to South Korea, Japan, and the United States. So they're playing an entirely different game. The rules are different, the objectives are different, and when North Korea comes out intermittently and engages the United States in negotiations, they have a very different kind of agenda, and they're very good at strategic deception as well. So don't take everything they say as the truth.
If the goal is, as I mentioned to you off the air, the primary audience for this podcast are people who work on the Hill, people who work on the policy in the policy community, even elected officials. If they are trying to get a more three-dimensional understanding of this mysterious nation, how do they go about it?
Well, look at the basic internal dynamic in the Korean peninsula. Korea remained undivided, was under a single government, single polity for 1,000 years before the partitioning by the Soviet Union and the United States in 1945. And over the past 8 decades almost, South Korea has emerged as a free and open democracy, one of the biggest economies in the world. North Korea has gone the exact opposite way. So, if you were to ask the impious question to North Korea's so-called supreme leader, Kim Jong-un, sir, why do you need to exist? What is the raison d'etre of the despotic People's Republic of Korea, North Korea, when you have such a sunny, successful Korean state in South Korea? It becomes an existential question. Why do you really need to live or to exist? And that basic dynamic is a cause of serious long-term existential concern for the Kim dynasty. The fear of one day being absorbed by the incomparably richer South. This is not, just a fancy or nightmare. It's a very serious question for the Kim regime. And I don't mean to defend them, of course, but the way they behave, the way they terrorize the people, block all information to the extent possible outside of North Korea so that the people don't realize how underprivileged and oppressed they are. All this is done by the North Korean state because they fear South Korea, the existence of South Korea. So North Korea, I believe, has not given up on its old dream of conquering and taking over the South, and the development of North Korea's nuclear weapons and ICBMs are key levers, key assets in this endgame.
When you use the word they, I think it's clear that just waiting for regime change is not an option here, and your book about the heir apparent suggests that there will not be relief necessarily after Kim. Is that a fair interpretation of what you've said and what you've written in the past?
We've seen 3 North Korean supreme leaders to this day, and in the early phase of their rule, all three have shown a propensity to be extra cruel, that is, resort to bloody purges, to make the point that I am unassailable. Don't even think about criticizing me or trying to challenge me. Now, if Kim Jong-un's sister were ever to rise as the first ever female supreme leader of North Korea, I think by virtue of her gender, her identity, a relatively young woman, she might have more to prove. She might be as or even more fierce and cruel than her brother or her predecessors. So it's not a very optimistic forecast, I realize, but again, don't underestimate the first sister of North Korea just because she's more photogenic and occasionally says nice things. She is a co-crime boss of this brutal regime.
The military capability, the major discussion in the early days of the Trump years when this was front page news for months was about the capability to strike the U.S. West Coast or some other part of the mainland with an ICBM carrying a nuclear device. Where is the North Korea nuclear program now to the best of our ability to penetrate the veil?
In the 90s and up to 2005, when North Korea told the world that it has nuclear weapons, a lot of people thought North Korea was bluffing because they're so backward and endlessly mockable. People didn't take them seriously. And even after 2005, with the first nuclear test in 2006, another one in 2009, and so on, a lot of people thought, oh, that's not a real nuclear weapon, it's not a real nuclear weapons state, and so on. So this tendency to patronize North Korea is a factor in getting North Korea wrong repeatedly, historically. Today, I don't know how many nukes they have, but experts say they estimate between 50 and 100, and they're rapidly expanding their nuclear arsenal. North Korea has conducted multiple ICBM tests and has shown that it has the range to hit every part of the continental United States as of its third ICBM test in 2017. So we have to take them seriously. They've been expanding the variety of their ballistic missile capabilities. So they are a real threat. And of course, the very low regard for human life that the regime shows, even the lives of its own people, is also a factor we have to take into consideration. They enjoy a higher pain threshold than democracies in the world.
My final question, Yoon, is more than theoretical because I know you've provided counsel to the U.S. government at the highest levels. What is your advice to policymakers at this moment in terms of thinking about the potential to negotiate with North Korea, how to craft policy around North Korea? What are your top tips?
Thank you. Don't underestimate North Korea. North Korea has agency. They have a strategy. They excel in lies, strategic deception. So the next time that North Korea turns back to a charm offensive, and they always do, I don't know when, but there will come a time when the Kim regime calls for peace talks. I fear then that his sister will be the face of the next post-provocation peace ploy by Pyongyang. Don't believe everything she says. Don't patronize her. Don't harbor any fancy that she's saying all sweet-sounding things like rapprochement, reconciliation, peace, and all those good things because she's impressed by you, that she's malleable, that you can teach her a lesson, and so on. Don't patronize the North Korean leaders. They are cruel and cunning, and they have an agenda, again, which is to try to compel the United States to abandon South Korea. I know it sounds far-fetched, but that's their game, to remove U.S. troops from South Korea, rendering South Korea more vulnerable, and take over the far richer, the far more successful Korean state, South Korea, and emerge as a unified, democratic or despotic People's Republic of Korea. They have an end game. They're working very hard at it. Don't underestimate them.
Yoon, thank you for your clear-eyed analysis and for joining us today.
Thank you, John.
For those of you interested in learning more, you can visit wilsoncenter.org and use the Programs tab at the top of the homepage to visit the Wilson Center's Indo-Pacific program, which also happens to be home to the Hyundai Motor Korea Foundation Center for Korean History and Public Policy. We'll be back with another episode of Need to Know soon. Until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Milewski. Thanks for your time and interest.